Good morning or good afternoon and welcome to lesson 14 of module 6. Today we are going to be using row and column frequencies, relative frequencies, to determine if there's an association between two categorical variables. So essentially you'll know you're successful today when you can look at a bivariate data table that's two-way frequency table and find those relative frequencies and then determine is there an association between the two variables that you see within the table. Okay? Let's go ahead and get started. All right, for example one, you're just going to do this one with me. Here is our situation. It says a sample of 400 participants, so 400 people were surveyed, and this is made up of teachers and students, was randomly selected from the middle schools and high schools in a large city. These participants responded to the following question. Which type of movie do you prefer to watch? 1, action movies, 2, drama, 3, science fiction, or 4, comedy. Movie preference and status, which is what they're calling, whether this is a teacher or a student, were recorded for each participant. So a few things I want to point out here. There's a total of 400 people being surveyed. There are two variables, someone's movie preference and whether they are a teacher or a student. And basically, well, they have 4 options, right? 4 options for their movie preference, 2 options for their status, teacher or student. And basically we want to figure out with this frequency table, are these two related? Do more teachers like a certain kind of movie? Do more students like a certain kind of movie? Is there an association between the two variables? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started on the next page with this in a frequency table. All right, the first thing I want to review with you is just question 1. It says 2 variables were recorded. Are these variables categorical or numerical? Well, the 2 variables were if this person was a teacher or a student and if they liked what their movie preference was. So none of those have to do with numbers. So these are categories. So this is categorical. Okay. Then it says the results of the survey are summarized in the table below. So the first thing we're going to do with this table is we are going to figure out some proportions. So just to review what we did in our last lesson, a proportion is a fraction, right? And we have a frequency at the top and a total at the bottom, okay? And we use the sentence that they ask us to find this fraction. It says, what proportion of participants who are teachers, so what participants who are teachers prefer action movies, okay? So it's asking us for this frequency, and this is the total people that we're looking at. We're looking at the total being the number of participants who are teachers. So how many total teachers were surveyed here? Well, I go to my teacher row, and I go to the total row, and I line those up. The total number of teachers surveyed was 100. So out of the 100 total teachers surveyed, how many of those liked action movies? From there, I go to the teacher row, and I go to the action movies. There were 40 of them. So the proportion of teachers surveyed who liked action movies, 40 out of the 100 teachers who liked action movies were surveyed here. Okay, we're going to continue to interpret this out on the next page. This is just review right now. All right, continuing, we're going to do a few more of these kind of questions. B, what proportion of participants who are teachers preferred drama movies? Okay. C, what proportion of participants who are teachers preferred science fiction? And D, what proportion of participants who are teachers preferred comedy? I want you to go ahead and create those proportions for me. They're just fractions. Later, when it asks us to find relative frequencies, that's when we turn them into decimals and percentages. So take about 30 seconds for B right now to write this proportion. All right, for B, we already said that there were 100 teachers here, so our denominator is 100. And the ones who are teachers who like drama movies was 20. Okay, go ahead and take about 10 seconds for this C. Out of the 100 teachers, how many like science fiction? Should have got the 10 liked science fiction. And then the last one here, comedy. There are 30 who like comedy. Okay, All in all, when we add up our action, drama, science fiction, and comedy, we get that there were 100 teachers surveyed here. Okay, and again, this is just finding the proportion. This is not the relative frequency. Relative frequency is turning that number into a decimal. Let's continue. All right, what we're going to be doing now is turning all those numbers that we just found into relative frequencies, which are just decimals. So we just did this row, but we need to turn those fractions that we found into decimals. The first fraction we had was 40 over 100. If we divide this out, 40 divided by 100, this is the same as 0.4. Okay, or 40%. You can write that as a decimal or percentage. I'm just going to leave it as decimal for right now. Okay. All right. And then for the second one, for B, our fraction was 20 out of 100. And if you divide that in your calculator, you get the decimal of 0.2. Okay. The third one, the number of teachers who preferred science fiction, our fraction was 10 out of 100. And if we divide that, we get 0.1. And then for comedy, the fraction was 30 out of 100. And if we divide that, we get 0.3. Okay? So we have filled out this row with our relative frequencies. We are now going to do this next part together and do the student row. Okay? So the first thing we need to do is, looking back at our last slide, figure out the proportions and then turn them into decimals. Okay? So the first one is what proportion of participants who are students prefer action, participants who are students prefer drama, participants who are students prefer science fiction, and then comedy. Okay? So one thing I do want you to know is that these fractions that we come up with are actually out of 300. So there are 300 total students surveyed. Okay? So you're going to have a fraction of 300 each time, something over 300. And you're just going to go back at your last slide and find the numerators really quickly for each of these. And then we will check them and then turn them into decimals. Go ahead and look back at your last slide to do that. All right, these are the fractions that you should have come up with. The fraction, or the proportion we call it, for students who like action movies is 120 out of 300, drama 60 out of 300, science fiction 30 out of 300, and comedy 90 out of 300. We're now going to divide these and turn them into decimals. So in your calculators, take about 45 seconds to turn each of these into decimals, and then we will go over them. All right, here are the numbers that you should have found. 120 divided by 300 is the same as 0.4. 60 divided by 300 is the same as 0.2. 30 divided by 300 is the same as 0.1. And 90 divided by 300, oh my gosh, is the same as 0.3. So these are your relative frequencies as decimals. One thing I do want to just point out to you, if you remember from a couple days ago, we can also turn these into percentages if we want. We just move our decimal point over twice, so this is the same as 40%. It didn't ask us to do this here, but I'm just showing you. This is the same as 20%. This is the same as 10%. And this is the same as 30%. Okay? But right now we're just going to put our decimals in our table. So the first one was 0.4, the second one was 0.2, third one was 0.1, and the fourth one was 0.3. Now I'm sure you have noticed something here. And what you should notice is that our relative frequencies are the exact same for students and teachers. Our proportions were different, right? Because we surveyed a lot more students than teachers. But when it came down to it, we had the same relative frequency for both students and teachers, which is interesting. So we're going to move on to the next slide and maybe draw a few conclusions about this, okay? All right, to just interpret this data a little bit further, I know we've already really talked about this, but it says, is a participant status, whether they're a teacher or student, related to the type of movie they prefer to watch? Why or why not? Well, if we think back to those relative frequencies we found, it's the exact same proportion each time, or the exact same relative frequency each time. So does it matter whether they're a teacher or a student? No, we got the same answers. We got the same relative frequencies for both teachers and students, so it doesn't really matter whether they're a teacher or a student. That does not affect their movie preference. Okay? What does it mean when we say that there's no association between the two variables? This means that one variable does not affect the other. In this case, whether you're a student or a teacher, it doesn't affect what your movie preference is going to be. Okay? Number 6 says, notice how the row relative frequencies, so we just did a lot of row relative frequencies, which means we were looking at rows of data, right? We looked at students and teachers. It says that the row relative frequencies for each movie type were the same, right? When this happens, we say that the two variables, in this case, movie preference and teacher status, are not associated. There's no association. So that's the verbiage that we're going to be using. We're just going to say there's no association. Another way of thinking about this is to say that knowing if a participant is a teacher or student, it doesn't really give you any information about their movie preference. So for some data tables and some surveys and things, if you say, oh, you're a girl, well, I can use that information to predict this about you. In this case, you can't use the information, whether they're a student or teacher, to predict anything about their movie preference because it's the same no matter what. Okay? Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. All right, in the last example, we were calculating row relative frequencies, which means we're talking about the total of students and the total of teachers. Now we're going to be calculating column relative frequencies, which means we will be talking about the total number of people who liked action movies. How many of those were teachers? Or the total number of people who liked drama movies. How many of those were students? Okay, so we'll be looking at these bottom totals down here for our proportions instead of these ones over here. Okay? It says you can also evaluate whether two variables are associated by looking at column relative frequencies instead of row relative frequencies. A column relative frequency is a cell frequency divided by the corresponding column total. For example, the column frequency of student/action cell, so if we're looking at the number of students who prefer action, it's going to be this 120 out of the total of 160 people who liked action movies. Okay, and when we do that math, we get 0.75. It says calculate the other column relative frequencies and write them in the table below. So it already gave us this one, 0.75. So let's do the teacher one real quick. So for this teacher, it's going to be 40 out of 160. For the number of teachers who prefer, out of the total number of teachers, so okay, let me backtrack. The teachers who prefer action movies out of the total number of people who prefer action movies is 40 out of 160. And if we turn that into a decimal, 40 divided by 160 is 0.25. Okay. Now I want you to do the drama for the student and the teacher. I'll give you about 30 seconds to come up with those fractions. All right, for the number of students, we have 60 students who prefer drama out of the total number of people who prefer drama, which was 80. And for the teachers, we have 20 out of the 80 who prefer drama. Okay, let's turn these into decimals real quick to add them into our table. 60 divided by 80 is 0.75. Okay, and 20 divided by 80 is 0.25. Shocker. All right, please go ahead and do the science fiction. Your fractions are going to be 30 out of 40 and 10 out of 40. Find those decimals. And you should have got 0.75 and 0.25. I'm sure you can predict the last one, but go ahead and do it anyways. 90 out of 120 and 30 out of 120. $90 divided by 120 is 0.75, and 30 divided by 20 is 0.25. All right, it says, what do you notice about the column relative frequencies for the 4 columns? Well, we have the same numbers throughout. The same frequencies are repeated throughout. What could we conclude about an association based on the column relative frequencies? Well, looking at these numbers, they're the same throughout. So what we can conclude is there's really no association here, right? Because these column relative frequencies are the same for all 4 columns, we would just say there's no association between the preference and the status of someone being surveyed. So there's no association. Okay. Our percentages never change up, or our frequencies never change up. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. All right, for this third example, you're going to begin trying this alone. You have all of your information up here. The first thing you need to do is to just fill in this frequency table with your numbers. We're not doing proportions, we're not doing decimals, we're not doing percentages yet. I just want the basic numbers here. So it says, in the survey described in example 2, gender for each of the 400 participants was also recorded. Some of the results of the survey are given below. Use these results to answer the following questions. Be sure to discuss the questions with your group members. So I'm going to fill in a few of these numbers here, and then you're going to go into some breakout rooms, and I want you to fill out this table with the numbers they give you up top. So the first thing I want you to know is there's a total of 400 people being surveyed. Okay? And from there, I want you to try to fill in as much as you can with the numbers that you're given with your breakout rooms, okay? 160 participants preferred action movies, 80 preferred drama, 40 preferred science fiction, 240 were females, 78 preferred drama, 32 male, etc. Okay, so go ahead and join the breakout rooms I'm about to invite you to and get this table filled out. We'll go over it when you come back. All right, we're just going to go through this together. It says 160 participants preferred action movies. So the total number of people who preferred action movies was 160. Okay. 80 preferred drama movies. So the total number of people who preferred drama was 80. 40 participants preferred science fiction. So the total number of people who preferred science fiction, whether boy or girl, we don't know yet, but there are 40 of them. And then lastly, comedy. It doesn't give us comedy, so how could we find this number? Well, if we know that there's a total of 400 overall, and we have 160 here, 80 of those here, 40 of those here, how can we find this answer? Well, we could just subtract. We could do 400 minus that 160, minus that 80, minus that 40. What's left over? How many participants have not been accounted for yet? Go ahead and message me in the chat what you get. All right, you should have got that there were 120 participants left over, and that means they had to enjoy the comedy. Okay. Moving on to our next section, it says 240 participants were females. So there were a total of 240 females. Okay, so that number is going to go right here because this is our female column. Now, if we now know that female column, can we figure out how many males there were? Yeah, if there's 240 females and there's some number of males and together those numbers equal 400, we can work backwards and find out what we're missing. So 400 minus 240, find the difference. We get a total of 160 male participants. Okay, again, I just subtracted 400 minus 240 and got that number, right? Next up, it says 78 female participants prefer drama movies. So 78 female participants prefer drama. This is the female column for drama. And so there are 78 females here. Okay. Well, if we know that there's 78 females there, can we figure out how many males prefer drama? Because we know how many total people prefer drama. Well, what's the difference between 78 and 80? 2. That means there's 2 males who prefer drama. Okay. Moving on to our next piece, it says 32 male participants preferred science fiction. So if we go to male participants for science fiction, it's right here. And it says 32 preferred that. Well, if there's a 32 there, can we figure out how many females preferred science fiction? Yeah. If there's a total of 40 people who like science fiction and 32 are males, that leaves a difference of 8 females. All right. Next, it says 60 female participants preferred action. So for our female action, we have 60. So what would be the males right here? How many males would prefer action? If 60 were females, there's a total of 160. That leaves 100 to be accounted for. All right. And then we have 2 columns that are blank. How can we find these answers? Well, we know our totals. Okay? We know our row totals. So we know that 60 plus 78 plus 8 plus blank equals 240. So we can find the difference. I'm just going to do 240 minus 60 minus 78 minus 8. And I'll get that there's 94 remaining. Okay? Please do this last one for me, and then we'll check it together. How many males preferred comedy? You can do this a couple of different ways. You can look at your row and find the difference, or you can look at your column and find the difference. It's up to you. You're going to get the same answer no matter what. So if you found the difference between 120 and 94, you would have got 26. If you found the difference between 160 and you took away 100, you took away 32, you took away 2, you would have also got 26. Okay? Make sure you have all of this down. Let me know if you have any questions before we move on. All right, for number 10 here, we're going to skip. We already skipped number 9. And what you're going to do is I'm going to write the numbers up on the right side for you. And then I just want you to create all the frequencies within this table. Okay? So we have 60, 100, 160. We have 78 to 80. 8, 32, 40, 94, 26, 120, and 240, 160, 400. Okay, so based on that, I want you to make a table of row relative frequencies. Okay, so row relative frequencies means you're looking at the total of your rows. So your denominator is going to be your total of males and females, not your total of people who liked comedy or action or drama. So all of these are going to be out of 240. Because that's the total for women. And all of these for the men are going to be out of 160. Okay, so I'll start you off for females who like actions. There were 60 out of the 240 who like that. And we're just going to turn that into a decimal. So 60 divided by 240. Let me do it real quick in my calculator. This is 0.25. I'm going to go ahead and turn that into my number. 0.25, or we know that's the same as 25%. Okay? And I want you to go through and do this for the entire table. I will give you a couple minutes to do it to find these row relative frequencies, and they're called row relative because we're using our totals from our rows as our denominators. Okay? All right, here are the answers you should have found for drama. Our frequency for the women was 0.325. For science fiction, I'm going to go ahead and erase comedy too. For science fiction, it was 0.033. And for comedy, it was 0.392. Okay. And then for our males on the bottom, the decimals or the relative frequencies you should have come up with are 0.625, 0.0125, 0.2, and 0.1625. Okay. Check that with my work. Let me know if you have any questions, and then we will move on to the next slide. All right, for this slide, we're going to use the data that we just came up with to answer some questions, draw some interpretations from this table. So a few things I do want to point out. It might be easier in some cases to turn these into percentages. So if you want to do that, you can. This would be 25%. This would be 32.5%. This would be 3.3%. And this would be 39.2%. For the guys down here, this would be 62.5%. This would be 1.25%, 20%, and 16.25%. It might be easier for you to just look at percentages than those decimals, okay? It's a lot quicker. So it says, suppose that you randomly pick one of the 400 participants. Use the table of row relative frequencies to answer these questions. So we have that table right up top. If you had to predict what type of movie this person chose, what would you predict? So looking at this data here, what would you predict? A random person, you don't know their gender, okay? What would they probably have a movie preference of? Go ahead and write your prediction down, and then we'll talk about it. All right, well, if I'm doing a random person, doesn't matter the gender, I'm just looking at what's the biggest group here. Who liked where was the most people choosing their preference at? And it's right here, the 62.5%. 62.5% of all the men liked action movies, and 25% of the women did too. So that's over 80% of the participants who liked action movies. So I would say action, because most of the participants chose this. Okay, that had the highest frequency. Okay, if you know that the randomly selected person is a female, would you still predict that it's action? What do you guys think? So if we know it's not a man, what would a woman be more likely to pick? Well, the largest percentage for women was comedy. Okay, so it should be comedy. Most females chose this. All right, has the greatest frequency. 14, if knowing the value of one of the variables provides information about the value of the other variable, then there's an association. So, did our answer change based on the gender here? Yes. And so, is there an association between these two data points? Yes. There is an association. And the reason there's an association is because our frequencies are different, right, for males and females. And so that does give us insight about what a male might choose versus what a female might choose. Okay? So these variables are associated. Let's go ahead and move on. So a few more conclusions we want to draw here. It says, what can be said when two variables are associated? Read the following sentences. Decide if each sentence is a correct statement based on the survey data. If it's not correct, explain why not. A says more females than males participated in the survey. This was correct. I don't know if you guys can remember those numbers from before, but there were more females that did participate in the survey. It says males tend to prefer action and science fiction movies. This was also correct from our data. You can look back and verify that. Is it a correct thing to say that being female causes you to prefer drama? No, that's not correct. And the reason that's not correct is because just because there's an association in our data tables, doesn't mean that that's a cause and effect relationship, right? Just because you're a female doesn't mean you prefer drama, even if a survey said that more females prefer drama. Okay? Tables are not cause and effect. Okay? Just because you're a female doesn't mean you like drama movies, even if a table shows that association. Okay? Let's go ahead and close this lesson out. All right, just to summarize, saying that two variables are not associated means that knowing information about one of those variables doesn't give you any information about the other. Okay, if they are associated, that means that if you do know something, one variable, you might know more about the other variable, right? In the case of the movies preferences, if you knew that someone's a female, that made you know more about what their movie preference might be. Okay, to determine if two variables are associated, we calculate the row relative frequencies. Okay. Another way to decide if there's an association is to calculate column relative frequencies. Okay. If the row relative frequencies are quite different for some of the rows, it's reasonable to say that there's an association. Let's get into what your exit ticket is going to look like for today on the next slide. All right, for your exit ticket today, you're going to have to create a two-way frequency table when given some information, like we did today. You'll then calculate the relative frequencies of the table, and you'll have to determine if there's an association. Okay, so if our numbers are different, yep, there's an association. If they're not, no, there's no association. After that, please complete your reflection and then work on any missing work or weekly work you may have.